Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. There is an election coming up. Maybe you heard about it. Been in all the papers. How would you like to know right now everything that will happen on Election Day? No predictions, certainties. We can do that because we have right here the Sultan of Suffrage, the Emperor of Elections, the Maven of the Marist College poll, Lee Miringoff. Election coverage like it ought to be. Next. Lee Miringoff, good to see you again.
Very happy to be with you, Mr. Guida.
And we're going to talk election, and I want to stipulate to you, the viewer, that we are taping this program 10 days before the election. So now I hear you immediately asking yourselves, so what are they doing? Whatever they tell me is going to be stale, outdated, useless. And I say nay, because
every day is different with Donald Trump as president, but there is a consistency in his approval rating, or should we say disapproval rating. I mean, things are changing, but then again, things are not changing. So we can talk about some stuff we can fully expect to happen on Election Day.
What you're saying is we know a lot of things right now that are not going to change.
Yes, and I always, but let me, a caveat to this is the old professor Casey Stengel used to say, it's very difficult making predictions, especially about the future. Now, Yogi Berra was thought to say that, but it really isn't true. As they say, you could look it up.
You could look it up. It was Casey Stengel.
Yeah, but there's a lot we know about
Who hit
election.
346 in the 1914 World Series, I think.
I did not know
Something like that. Some extraordinary number. Anyway, yeah, and I guess one of the things we know, and everybody has said, but maybe we can put a fresh spin on it, is this is a referendum. There's going to be a referendum on Mr. Trump.
It's a nationalized election, okay? And that's not unusual when you have midterm elections, especially the first midterm election, you know, depending on whether the guy gets reelected or not. But that they tend to be about, you know, has this individual, has the president delivered? And Donald Trump, of probably any in recent memory, is casting a long shadow over the midterm elections.
Yeah.
He himself is out there on a daily basis campaigning. That's not always the case with presidents. Barack Obama did a little bit, but didn't really, get out there much.
Yeah,
Trump has been out there. He's making it about him unless he loses the House, whereupon it's the House's fault. That's what he said.
Course.
That's I'm just saying what
he
said.
says everything.
Yes.
Let's go a little deeper into that concept of this is a referendum on Donald Trump. It's the first time voters have had to nationally have had a chance to vote since he was elected.
Yes, so that's a big deal right there.
Yeah.
First
there are a couple of interesting opinions out there. One of them I was interested to see came from the Des Moines Register, a very respected newspaper, conservative voice in the Midwest, very influential, very well respected in its political analysis. They came out with a scathing editorial against the Republican Party, and in so doing, the Des Moines Register endorsed all four Democrats running for Congress in Iowa. They have 4 seats. And what they said is, this is not a referendum on Trump to us. This is a referendum on Congress. Congress has failed us. They didn't reform immigration or even come up with their own plan, and they left the DACA kids dangling. They didn't end Obamacare or come up with their own plan. They passed a tax cut, but it's fiscally irresponsible. Republicans, who were the fiscally responsible party, and they were not a check and balance on Trump.
And to me, that's almost the most important accusation or statement of the editorial, because traditionally, and the way the government is formed, Congress, whether you have the same party or not, is supposed to be an independent check, both for nominations in the Senate to things like the Supreme Court, and also for legislative things in the House and in the Senate. And that really hasn't occurred. Now, sometimes, in this era of the imperial president, presidents dominate, but you're talking about a Congress and the president of the same party, and a legislative record which the singular achievement is pretty much the tax cut, which that editorial calls irresponsible, but also it's a tax cut that the American public has soured on.
Yeah.
And despite
it, I saw some interesting numbers. We'll come back to those.
Yeah.
I want to hit the bottom line of the Des Moines Register's editorial. I want to quote this to you. The paper saying, after all of its argument, it says this: in becoming the party of Trump, the Republicans have forsaken traditional conservative thinking and given voters no rational alternative to the Democrats. The party must be voted out of power and spend a couple of years becoming again the party of Lincoln, not the party of Trump. That's strong stuff.
See, when Donald Trump was the candidate, there was a lid on him within the Republican Party. It was around 35%. Now, the Republican Party, the no-Trumpers or whatever you want to call them, they have vanished within the Republican Party. The Republican Party is Donald Trump's party right now. Congress, to get back to your original question, has really forsaken its role as a check on the president in many respects. And so you do have a Republican Party. If you look at the two political parties, they're very different in style. Democrats fall in love. So they find a candidate and they just, this is, everything. And then if that person doesn't get a nomination, it's very tough to then rally behind whoever the nominee is. There's a real reluctance on that part. So if Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. Okay, so they fall in line. So
fall in line.
So Donald Trump is the nominee. They all rallied, despite what was a really rough campaign with all kinds of revelations when he was running for president. They were coming out, including the tapes, right before the end and all that stuff. But they all sort of stepped to the, they marched in line. And now, where are any votes against things that he wants to do coming out of Congress? He's pitching a shutout. So there is no alternative voice to Donald Trump within the Republican Party, and that's, I think, what the Des Moines Register is talking about.
Very powerful stuff. Yeah. We'll take one further dive into this referendum idea and we'll move on. The New Yorker, in an editor, not a voice of conservatism, obviously, a liberal voice. The New Yorker editorial yesterday called this upcoming election a referendum on the effectiveness of voter suppression, which is going on quite virulently in the South. And as the New Yorker pointed out, even in the North, in Ohio, in Indiana, in Wisconsin, there are laws and regulations. And what do you think of that?
I think to me, it's a misguided, there's no evidence. There was a commission that he established, President Trump did after the election, and they really didn't do anything, and it was not really seen as serious as intent. The problem with 2016...
serious intent to
uncover that which wasn't.
Right. Yeah.
For all intents and purposes. The problem with the 2016 election was interference by Russia in hacking and doing all kinds of things that are slowly but surely becoming evident. Right. I think that's the... Going back to Donald Trump, though, one other thing I did want to point out, because I said that this is not unusual that the president is sort of the referendee of all this. 67% in the poll that we did at Marist with NPR and PBS just recently, 67% of voters say Donald Trump is a major factor in determining their vote for Congress right now. 47% said the same of Barack Obama. So, yes, Donald Trump is indeed casting an unusually long shadow over this campaign.
Yeah, and of course that 67% could be very strong Trump supporters or very strong Democratic.
Get back to your introduction. They're largely Democrats who see this as the first time to voice a message of disapproval from the 2016 election. So there's been polls and marches and protests, but this is the first time they can go to the ballot box.
Well, getting back just to close the loop on voter suppression. Let's call this what it is. It's efforts by the Republican Party, largely, whether statewide or nationally, to keep blacks from voting. And they've got all of these rules and regulations, and your name, if it has a middle initial, it better be, have a period after it, and if it doesn't, then you can't vote. And the New Yorker called it trying to put a white thumb on the demographic scale. This country is far along the way to a point where white people will no longer be the majority, getting closer all the time. You can argue that when we see the results, have the voter suppression efforts worked?
Well, I think there's some court cases that are also now in Georgia, for example, where an African-American woman is running for governor.
Right.
There was the Secretary of State, who happens to be now her opponent, was sort of holding back on people sort of like not acting on making decisions. The court has overruled that. So, in fact, that has stopped.
Yeah, I think there were 50,000 more black voters who were claiming they were being disenfranchised one way or another by this guy who was running for...
Yeah, and I think we have to also worry about we have a lot to worry about in the democracy, but one thing we have to worry about is just, the voting machines, how many there are, whether you have longer lines if you're in a city to vote than if you're in there's all kinds of things. We've polled a lot of this, and sure enough, not a surprise, but people of color are the ones who feel that the lines are longer, it's harder to get to the polls, there may not be transportation available, Right now, though, it's interesting, a third of the country, or maybe more, will actually vote before Election Day. People are voting right now with the early voting, and it's actually election month.
Right.
So even though the show is being taped in advance, it actually is already happening. So we're actually late, not early.
Well, I mean, we could do another whole show, and I don't want to go there, but at least we'll go on to the side road. We could do another whole show about the way this country votes and why we have elections on Tuesday instead of a Sunday when it would be so much easier. But
we do need to find a way of voting that doesn't have so much different registration and rules, and it's a mess.
Yeah, it is a mess. It's a terrible mess.
That's not a partisan statement. That's a mess.
It's a mess.
Generally.
I mean, I've stood on lines here in New York to vote. I remember in 2008, I guess it was. It was an hour, more than an hour, in the public school in the parking lot.
It was a great story about John Kerry in 2004, and I forget where it was, maybe Ohio, I'm not even sure, but he was looking to see, he was riding around that day, the day of election, and he went to some suburban areas that Bush was supposed to do well in, and he didn't see anybody, oh boy, not anybody there, good. Went to the cities where he was going to do strong, and he saw long lines, and he said, boy, they're really turning out. No, it had to do with the voting booths. I mean, you could just breeze in and breeze out. It was drive-through voting in the suburbs, and the city was, one old machine that probably didn't work too well.
It wasn't by accident.
Yeah.
All right, let's get back to what we know.
Okay.
You mentioned probably the singular achievement of the Republican Congress was the tax cut. Des Moines Register and others calling it fiscally irresponsible, but nonetheless, an achievement, and they're not running on it. No. Why?
It's unpopular. People are not seeing the benefit. So and Republicans were very unhappy when Donald Trump said, and we're going to do another one, even though before the election, even though Congress wasn't even going to be in session. Notice no Republicans really picked up that message and said, yes, we're going to go more tax cuts. The answer is people are not seeing it. And the economy's doing well, unemployment's low, growth is good, but they're not seeing it in their making ends meet category, and that's really where the bottom line is.
I've got numbers that back up what you say from an organization called Bankrate.com. 78% of people who earn less than $30,000 a year say that they have seen no improvement in their fiscal life, their financial life since Trump was elected. 27% of those people say things are worse for them. And these are the low-end people.
Sure.
But when you're only earning over $75,000, those folks are feeling pretty good.
So, and that is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, that is where the reaction is to that. So the tax cut is not the answer. Then you talked about Obamacare. Republicans now are talking about the pre-existing conditions as if that's something they have put forward, when in fact it's a key part of Obamacare. Walker in Wisconsin, the governor, is on the one hand trying to prevent pre-existing conditions, while on the other hand claiming that he supports it.
Same with Cruz in Texas.
So you have
he's done everything he could to get rid of pre-existing conditions. He's out there campaigning as if he's the champion.
So it's complicated. Look, Obamacare was very complicated. And President Obama had if you watch those town forums that he used to hold, you'd get done and say, okay, what is this about? I mean, there were markets and there were rates and there was this and that. It was very, very complicated. But there were certain parts of it, pre-existing conditions, that was kind of clear. There were other parts which were kind of very, very clear. Yeah. And those, people are, upset that those are, talking about not seeing the benefit from someone, people are now feeling the loss. There are many more people who don't have health insurance than did in the closing years of the Obama year. So there's no replacement legislation, as you said.
Exactly.
There's nothing to go in a different direction.
And to give the Des Moines Register its due in the editorial where they was talking about they didn't, failure of Congress, the Republican Congress, they didn't repeal Obamacare. It's not that the paper editorially wanted Obamacare gone. They wanted to see a Republican plan. Right. What they were really angry about is that the Republicans never came up with a plan, a cogent plan of their own, as you point out.
I think right now the administration and the Senate especially has been all about the Supreme Court and moving that for years to come by changing the character of the court. We recently witnessed that. And I think they're into that far more than legislative action. And the other side of it is on the regulatory side, undoing a lot of environmental things and things that you can do independent of Congress that the executive branch has been able to move forward on.
Well, speaking of the Supreme Court and the turmoil over the confirmation of the latest fellow Kavanaugh, you're seeing that's going to have an impact on the voting or not?
Well, it's interesting because obviously this has occurred right in the middle of the midterm elections. And yes, there was a rallying of the Republican base around Kavanaugh and Trump and the Senate Republicans. My sense of it was that was kind of occurring anyway and was likely as you've heard about the Democrats have more enthusiasm than Republicans. Well, there was this gap. Both went up. The Republicans went up more because it was a bigger area they could grow. And that did happen. So I think that has occurred to some extent. I think that was going on anyway. I don't think, if there's anything that the Kavanaugh hearings and the last month have done, is it's turned some independents more in the Democrats' direction.
Because how important are independents?
They're really important. They could be the tipping point in a lot of congressional districts because you have Democrats, you have Republicans, the turnout we know is going to be record-breaking for a midterm election.
Really?
It's going to be, huge, as the phrase goes.
Well, let's just parse that sentence. Record-breaking for a midterm election. Midterm elections, the turnout is usually lousy, frankly lousy.
It could be, in the past, it's been like 40% or so.
Do we think that, are independents going to come out? Are women going to come out? Are the young people going to come out?
Some things we definitely know is, one, the turnout's going to be huge. Two, we know that the women vote will be unusually large. We don't know yet about young people. In some places we're seeing in our state polls, there is that enthusiasm, that interest to kind of get into the action. Young people are interesting. They want to really do things constructively and positively for the society. They're just not convinced that the political system is the place to do that. So if they can be involved with,
that's an interesting point.
Building houses or helping in their community, they're very much involved with that. But the actual political system, they haven't found to be a place for them. So that's, I think, a test for the Democrats still. But women are definitely going to vote in unusual numbers. And the net effect of this will be, not to get too wonky on you, but when we do our polls...
I don't mind wonky.
A little wonk? Okay. So when we do our polls and we look at the registered voters and then you look at the people who are likely to vote, in a midterm election, the likely voters, which are the people who are going to vote, tend to be more Republican because young people and people of color and others tend to fall out and it becomes a little bit more Republican. This time, we're seeing that the registered and the likely are very similar, suggesting that the net effect of this higher turnout will be a benefit for the Democrats. And if that's the case, that puts the Democrats in good shape in the House, but still not necessarily in good shape in the Senate because they have to defend 10 seats that President Obama, Democrats have that President Trump, I should say, carried in 2016.
Yeah.
And so that's very difficult. Those are red states, and Democrats have to find a way to.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying, it's kind of interesting to hear about the energy that you're finding among the young people, but it's sort of been a given. Shouldn't use the word given, but it's sort of assumed the Republicans will retain the Senate, the Democrats will take the House. Will they if they do take the House, will they have a majority?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the expectation, but that's based on prior trends. And with Donald Trump, normal is not necessarily the norm, and we certainly have seen that both in his campaign for the nomination and his election and in his governing. But there is that sense that, when a president's approval rating has been historically below 50% in the midterms, that president's party has lost an average of 36 seats in the House.
And what roughly is Trump's rating at the moment?
In the 40s, low 40s, so he's below 50, and the Democrats need to take 23 seats to get the majority in the House. So if history plays out again, they're sitting with about a 10-seat cushion in the House, and that will make a big difference for investigations, for committee chairmanships. People in this area.
New York, it's going to be a boon for New York, or at least Congress people who come from New York.
Yes.
I don't know if it's going to be a boon for us eventually. But here's what happens if the House goes Democratic. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee will be Jerry Nadler, Congressman Jerry Nadler. The chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee will be Eliot Engel. And the chairman of the Appropriations Committee will be Nita Lowey.
First woman ever in that role. Would be. Yeah.
Now, I told you at the beginning of this program, we're going to give you certainties. But I'm going to deviate from that right now and ask Lee, what do you imagine the House Judiciary Committee under Jerry Nadler is going to? Are they going to jump in and go after this guy with investigation after investigation? They're going to get his tax return?
Well, they're going to try. And I wonder whether that, I saw Newt Gingrich saying this could end up in the Supreme Court, and then we'll find out if all the work for Kavanaugh paid off. I mean,
exactly.
You fill in all your meaning under that one. But so I mean, there's going to be there's a different team in town. There's going to be a whole new direction. Legislation will be even harder to pass, or certainly will have to require compromise, because there's
what's that word?
Compromise. It used to be a big thing in Washington.
Used to be, the two sides used to compromise.
Yeah, but now, see, as soon as the final vote is counted on Election Day this year, we're running for president in 2020. So everybody's going to be locked in again for the next battle. That's what it's all become, red versus blue. And it's one battle after another, and there's really very little give in Washington, and there's not much give with your friends and your neighbors and people you work with, and I mean, everybody's gotten really locked in to the point that the red and blue are just miles apart.
It's a really toxic environment, and I'm not breaking any ground saying that, and it's just dispiriting in so many ways.
Toxic is a good word.
To the
toxic is a very good word to describe.
You think back to the 70s, for instance, and the Watergate, and there was comedy. Yes, a president was being tried and eventually convicted, even though the conviction didn't happen in Congress. I mean, he resigned, Nixon resigned first, but there was statesmanship. I mean, we haven't seen statesmanship. Nobody knows the meaning of that word anymore.
No. Well, not to get in the middle of a battle here, but at that point, if facts were one thing, they might dominate the discussion. And now we seem to have alternative facts, and that really does change the dialogue.
Right.
Because if you and I disagree over whether the Earth is flat or round, there's not going to be much common ground about anything after that, like transportation policy, if we have such a different worldview. No pun intended there.
Well,
so it's a different ballgame.
Alternative facts. It's just I can't. It's so Orwellian that it's. Again, I'm very original. But
Yeah, but I got
all
to
right.
hand it to Chuck Todd. So there he is. He's having an interview,
Right.
and your seat is actually a harder seat than my seat right now because you have to sort of, you don't know what this guy's going to say, like what I'm going to say right now, and so you guys have to sort of react.
Sure.
So there's Chuck Todd. I guess it was on Meet the Press, and Kellyanne Conway comes up with alternative facts. You have to be quick to go, hello, what are, what is that? And so I got to hand it to him. He's a buddy of mine, so that's not a big deal. But I mean, I think he, just sort of jumped out of his seat.
Well,
like, what is an alternative fact? I don't know.
I don't know either, and I'm glad I don't have to
Jump out of
be in those positions. A quick, about 30 seconds.
Okay.
So if the Democrats take the House, you said it at the top, but what are we going to hear from Donald Trump? What's the fake?
Blame
what's the
Congress.
fake news?
Donald Trump, never takes that responsibility for anything that goes wrong. He will blame the House. He's already said he would. So I mean, it's no surprise there.
Yeah.
He will not say what Barack Obama said when he got shellacked, which is what he said. Donald Trump won't take that one.
What did Obama say?
I got shellacked.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And Donald Trump will not
No,
say that.
no.
That's not
Somebody
his,
else's.
That's not in his playbook.
He never takes responsibility. Yeah. All right, Lee, we could continue this forever. It's a delight to talk to you. It's always so informative, and I'm glad you found time to be here. And
Pleasure. Yeah, pleasure.
And we will please vote. Make sure you vote, and we'll see you next time.